Hello everyone, and welcome back to Story Villa. Tonight, we set out into the frozen wilderness of Alaska with 8 chilling accounts from those who dared to explore the last frontier's most desolate ghost towns. In this episode, we will travel through abandoned mining camps and forgotten frontier communities, uncovering harrowing stories of supernatural encounters, adapted from real reports shared by witnesses scattered across the state. Each account has been carefully gathered from first-hand testimonies of individuals who claim to have faced the unexplainable in these isolated places where the line between the living and the dead grows dangerously faint. From phantom miners endlessly working their empty shafts to the spectral laughter of children echoing through deserted schoolhouses, these stories reveal that certain places refuse to remain buried in time for the safety and privacy of those who stepped forward with their experiences. Some names and exact locations have been altered. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe to Story Villa for spine-tingling true horror content that explores the darkest corners of forgotten America. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another terrifying collection of tales. Now, settle into your seat as we descend into Alaska's most haunted ghost towns. I have been inspecting deserted mines across Alaska for nearly 6 years, and in that time, I have witnessed things that would make most people think twice about their chosen career. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work as a mine safety inspector for the state. The work is not glamorous, but someone has to ensure these abandoned tunnels don't turn into death traps for curious adventurers or kids looking for a thrill. Usually, the job consists of routine inspections, checking for cave-ins, dangerous gases, and the stability of support structures. But what occurred at the old Kakot mine changed everything I believed about this profession. It was late October of 2023 when I received an urgent call from my supervisor. Reports had surfaced of strange lights and bizarre sounds coming from the abandoned Kakot copper mine, and local authorities requested an official inspection before the brutal winter storms made travel impossible. Kennett remains one of Alaska's most renowned ghost towns, nestled deep within the Wrangell Mountains, about 5 hours northeast of Anchorage. The mine ran from 1911 until 1938, producing millions in copper, or before its resources ran dry, and the company abruptly pulled out, leaving behind an entire settlement frozen in history. I had visited Kakot twice before on routine assignments, but always during daylight and with a full crew in tow. This time would be different. The reports always described strange events happening between midnight and 3 in the morning, so I would have to perform a nocturnal inspection if I wanted to document what people were seeing. My supervisor paired me with a young geologist named Marcus Chen, fresh out of school and eager to prove himself. Looking back now, I wish I had demanded to go in alone. We arrived at Kennecott just after 11 p.m., driving the last 20 miles along a dirt track that hadn't been maintained since the 1940s. The settlement rests at the foot of enormous mountain peaks, and even under the glow of a full moon, the shadows of those ridges made the town appear swallowed by darkness. The major buildings still remain: the towering mill, the general store, the hospital, and long rows of worker houses where miners and their families once lived. During daylight, tourists sometimes wander through to take pictures and soak in the history. At night, however, it feels like stepping into another world entirely. We parked beside the old mill and began unloading our gear. Our standard safety loadout included gas detection units, tools for structural analysis, powerful LED floodlights, and emergency communication systems. Marcus was clearly uneasy. I could tell by how often he checked and rechecked his devices. He had read the witness accounts of strange lights and sounds, and it was obvious his imagination was running wild. I tried to reassure him, telling him we would most likely find nothing more than failing electrical wiring causing sporadic light discharges, or perhaps animals nesting inside the buildings. The Kakot mine sprawls across several levels, with the main shaft leading into an extensive network of tunnels reaching deep inside the mountain. Back in its prime, the operation was considered advanced for its era, boasting electric lighting, ventilators, and even its own power plant. When the company abandoned the site, most of the infrastructure was left intact, though decades of Alaskan winters had done their damage. We stepped into the main shaft at exactly midnight, our headlamps cutting sharp beams through the overwhelming blackness of the mine. The air remained a steady 38 degrees inside, cold enough for our breath to fog, but not freezing. Every footstep echoed harshly along the rock walls as we pressed forward into the tunnels, heading for the sections where people had reported lights. Roughly 300 yards in, we reached the first major chamber. This was once a checkpoint where miners assembled during shift change. A large circular space with several passages splitting off into darkness. I was setting up my gas detection array when Marcus suddenly gripped my arm. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, barely louder than his own breath. I stopped and strained my ears. At first, only the ordinary noises of an old mine reached me, the dripping of water somewhere in the distance, the occasional groan of aging timber supports, and the faint whistle of air sliding through ancient ventilation shafts. Then, I heard it faint at first, then unmistakable. A steady clanging sound, metal striking metal, echoing from deeper inside the complex. Probably just thermal expansion, I told Marcus, though the explanation didn't fully convince me. Metals contract and expand with temperature changes, and these beams have been doing it for decades. Still, the noise was too regular, too deliberate to be dismissed as random. It followed a pattern, like hammering or machinery in operation. We agreed to investigate, following the sound into a narrow side tunnel I had never checked in earlier inspections. This corridor was tighter than the main passageways, with rough-cut walls still showing the marks of hand tools rather than machines. Clearly, the first miners had dug this stretch manually while chasing a copper vein. Our headlamps illuminated timbers that looked ancient and precarious, though my instruments said they were still holding. As we pressed deeper, the metallic clanging intensified, now joined by another sound, voices, human voices murmuring low words I couldn't quite make out. Marcus froze beside me, his eyes wide. "There's someone else down here," he said. My first thought was trespassers, urban explorers, scavengers, or artifact hunters. It wouldn't be the first time people had broken into a restricted site, but the closer we drew, the more I realized something was off. The voices weren't speaking English or any language I had ever heard. They carried an uncanny hollowness, as though echoing from a great distance or filtered through some distorted recording. As we rounded a bend in the tunnel, we came face to face with the mouth of a vast subterranean chamber. It was clearly one of the mine's original excavation zones, with overhead tracks for ore carts still intact and clear signs of heavy digging etched into the stone walls. Yet what froze us in place was the sight waiting within that cavern. There were lights, not the sterile gleam of electricity, but the wavering, golden shimmer of lanterns and oil lamps, and the silhouettes of people. Human shapes moved methodically across the chamber, hauling gear and wielding tools, all laboring in what looked like a living, breathing, mining operation. The clanging we had been hearing came from their pickaxes and shovels, striking the rock face, while the voices were men calling orders to one another. I stood rooted for what seemed like an eternity, unable to reconcile what I was seeing. My logical mind screamed it had to be some elaborate setup, perhaps a reenactment staged without our knowledge, but deep down I sensed it was nothing of the sort. The light itself was wrong and even, flickering, throwing off shadows that drifted independently of their owners. The figures too were not fully solid, their bodies hazy and translucent, as if formed from vapor rather than flesh. Marcus's grip clamped down on my arm so hard I could feel his fingers pressing through the padding of my jacket. His whole body quivered, though I could not tell whether it was the cold or raw fear that shook him. I fumbled for my radio to call our supervisor, but when I keyed the mic, Only a crackle of static hissed back at me. We were deep enough that ordinary signals shouldn't have reached. But the repeater we had set up outside should have carried my voice. Something was blocking it. One of the spectral workers turned toward us, and for the first time, I saw his face. He appeared to be in his 40s, his features worn yet sharp, with a thick mustache and eyes that glimmered with their own eerie light. His clothes belonged to another era: rugged canvas trousers, a woolen shirt, and a leather cap outfitted with a carbide lamp. But the most chilling detail was that I could see the rock wall faintly through him. He existed, and yet he did not, like a photograph developed twice on a single strip of film. The miner fixed his gaze on me and smiled faintly. Lifting one hand in a gesture, I could not decipher welcome or warning. I could not tell. Then, without another glance, he turned back to his task, his pick striking the stone with mechanical rhythm. Around him, the others carried on their duties undisturbed, loading carts, bracing timbers, shouting to each other in that uncanny, faraway language. We lingered in silence, held in thrall by the impossible tableau. Time seemed to slip and stretch, as though inside that chamber, the world's clock ticked to a different rhythm altogether. Minutes or hours. It was impossible to say. Finally, Marcus tugged my sleeve and motioned back toward the way we had come. His intent was unmistakable. We had to leave immediately. Step by step we edged away, careful not to disturb whatever phantom labor unfolded before us. Once the bend in the tunnel hid the chamber from sight, we abandoned caution and hurried through the dark passageways toward the surface. Neither of us dared to break the silence. Our thoughts were too heavy, our fear too raw. When at last we emerged into the cold mountain air, dawn was just brushing the peaks with pale light. We had been below for over 6 hours, though it felt nothing like that. Wordlessly, we packed our equipment and drove toward Anchorage, neither speaking a single word of what had transpired. Not until the following day at the office did Marcus finally turn to me and ask what I thought we had witnessed. I gave him the only answer I could. I did not know. Every attempt at a rational explanation collapsed beneath the weight of the details. No mining had been active at Kennett since 1938. No reenactment groups were slated to use the grounds. The figures we saw were insubstantial, and the strange tongue they spoke did not match any community of workers ever recorded there. In my official report, I wrote only of a standard inspection with no notable incidents. I could not bring myself to describe the truth, because I knew it would be dismissed outright. Yet the memory gnawed at me, refusing to fade. In the weeks after, I dug into the mine's history, and what I unearthed disturbed me even more than the phantoms themselves. Records confirmed multiple deadly accidents during its years of operation: collapses, gas explosions, machinery malfunctions, claiming at least 37 lives between 1911 and 1938. Many of these men were laid to rest in crude, unmarked graves near the mine, their families too poor to bring them home. I have come to believe we saw the midnight crew still at work, bound eternally to their posts, doomed to chip at barren rock and load empty carts in an endless loop. They remain trapped in those tunnels, repeating their final shift long after their deaths. I have never set foot in Kennett again, and I asked my supervisor to assign that site to other inspectors. Within months, Marcus had transferred to surface duty and avoided underground projects entirely. We never revisited the subject, though sometimes our eyes would meet across the office, and in his face I recognized the same haunted look I carried in my own. Reports of lights and sounds continue to surface from Kennett, always in the dead of night, always from those who swear they have glimpsed what cannot be real. I believe them. I know the midnight shift endures in those tunnels, trapped beyond time itself. For me, venturing into ghost towns isn't just a pastime, it is my livelihood and my passion, sustaining me in ways most could never comprehend. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and for the past 8 years I have roamed the far reaches of Alaska, combing through forsaken ruins for relics that whisper of lives long past. Many call me reckless for spending weeks alone in these desolate landscapes, but I find a strange kind of magic in unearthing a forgotten fragment of history. In Anchorage, I run a small antique shop named Forgotten Alaska, where I sell my discoveries to both avid collectors and curious travelers seeking a tangible piece of frontier lore. The greatest profits come from the rare finds original mining gear, carefully documented native Alaskan artifacts, or garments preserved from the days of the gold rush. Women's apparel from the early 20th century is particularly valuable, since so little survived the brutal climate and the demands of survival. That is why my heart leaped when I first heard whispers of untouched structures still standing in Da, a nearly unknown ghost town near Skagway. Dia was once a booming settlement during the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s, serving as a key launch point for hopeful prospectors making their way over the Chilkoot Pass. At its height, the town boasted more than 8,000 inhabitants, numerous shops, saloons, and all the hallmarks of a thriving frontier outpost. But when the railroad finally stretched into Skagway in 1900, Dia was deserted nearly overnight, its streets and businesses left behind, as though the life had been drained from them in an instant. I had been tipped off by a fellow dealer that hidden within Da still stood an old general store containing untouched merchandise dating back to the 1890s. According to the account, the last owner had sealed the place tightly before departing, and decades of brutal weather had kept most scavengers at bay. Getting there would not be easy, a mix of long driving and strenuous hiking that consumed nearly a full day. But the promise of such a discovery made the effort worthwhile. On a crisp September morning in 2023, I set out, following the Alaska Highway northward toward the Canadian border before veering west toward Skagway. The last leg of the trip demanded that I leave the paved road behind and force my truck along a rugged mining trail that put its four-wheel drive to the test. Daa itself rests in a valley ringed by imposing peaks, reachable only during the fleeting summer and fall when the snow loosens its grip on the high passes. Today the ghost town consists mostly of scattered foundations, a handful of leaning structures, and the skeletal timbers of what had once been a busy pier stretching into the Lynn Canal. The majority of its buildings had collapsed long ago. Yet, at the center of town I could clearly see the general store described by my contact. The store was a weathered two-story structure, its siding faded and its peaked roof miraculously holding strong after enduring more than a century of Alaskan storms. The front door was bound by a corroded padlock, frozen in place with rust, but in the back, a loose board provided just enough of a gap for me to squeeze inside. The instant I stepped through, I sensed I had stumbled upon something rare. The interior still carried the lingering scent of wood smoke and old leather, while dust motes drifted lazily in sunbeams filtering through cracked panes. The ground floor had once been the retail space, with wooden shelves stretching along the walls and a long counter cutting down the center. Most of the goods had been removed before the doors closed, yet fragments of the original stock still remained: rusted hand tools, empty glass bottles, bolts of cloth preserved inside sealed containers. But it was the upper level that truly stunned me. This floor had served as the proprietor's residence, and it looked as though the family had simply departed without warning, leaving every possession behind. Furniture from the 1890s still stood in place. Personal photographs sat on dressers, books lined the shelves, and clothing hung neatly in an armoire, untouched by time. For an antique dealer like myself, this was the kind of miraculous, untouched find that others only dream of. I spent hours carefully examining the space, documenting details, photographing, and making notes on the most valuable artifacts. A handsome dining set easily worth $5,000, several oil paintings that appeared to be originals, and a complete china set from a prominent manufacturer back east all caught my eye. Yet it was while I was cataloging the china that I noticed something even more extraordinary. In the corner of the armoire, partly hidden behind other garments, a white piece of fabric drew my attention. Gently moving the clothes aside, I uncovered what proved to be the most breathtaking wedding gown I had ever seen. The dress was crafted of ivory silk, adorned with exquisite beadwork and delicate lace that must have consumed countless hours of careful stitching. Its design was typical of the 1890s, a snug bodice, voluminous skirt, and a train trailing gracefully behind, but its condition was what left me awestruck. After more than 120 years, the gown looked as though it had been sewn yesterday. The silk showed no discoloration, the beadwork was intact, and the fabric bore not a single stain or tear. Having handled vintage garments for years, I knew how impossible this was. Silk from that era should have grown brittle and yellowed long ago, especially given Alaska's punishing weather cycles. Yet here was a gown that looked ready for a bride to wear tomorrow. Even stranger, when I lifted it from the armoire, it weighed almost nothing, light as air. And when I held it near the window to inspect the beading, I could swear it shifted slightly, as if stirred by a breeze, though the air was perfectly still. Recognizing its potential value, I decided to transport the gown back to Anchorage for assessment and eventual sale. A Klondike-era wedding dress in this pristine state could easily fetch $20,000 from the right buyer. I wrapped it in acid-free tissue, placed it inside a garment box designed for antique textiles, and loaded it carefully into my truck. The return trip was uneventful, though my thoughts kept circling back to the dress. Unlike other finds that left me with excitement over profit, this one carried a strange weight, not financial, but emotional. It felt less like merchandise and more like a responsibility. Late that night, I carried the box into my workshop, where I kept my tools for restoration. My plan was to research its history and prepare it for eventual sale. But first, I wanted to create a photographic record. When I unwrapped the gown under my studio lights, it was as flawless as before. Glowing ivory silk, intricate beading sparkling under the lamps. I began photographing every detail. The bodice, the sleeves, the embroidery, the elegant train. It was while focusing on the train that I saw her for the first time. In my camera's viewfinder appeared the image of a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, her dark hair styled elaborately in the fashion of the 1890s. She was strikingly beautiful, her large eyes gazing directly at me through the lens, but when I lowered the camera, there was nothing there. Raising it again, she reappeared, this time reaching toward the dress as though trying to touch it. My heart pounded as I set the camera down, shaken to my core. Over the following days, the occurrences multiplied. Each time I attempted to study or photograph the dress, I caught glimpses of her in the reflection of mirrors, in passing shadows at the edge of my vision, or standing silently in the corners of my workshop. Even the dress itself began to act strangely. I would leave it arranged one way only, to return and find it subtly shifted, as if someone had been handling it. At times the silk, which should have been cool, felt unexpectedly warm to the touch, like fabric just taken off after being worn. Hoping for answers, I researched the history of Dia's general store. What I uncovered only deepened the mystery. The store had once belonged to the Patterson family, who arrived in 1897 at the height of the rush. Thomas Patterson ran the store while his wife Margaret cared for their daughter Sarah, just 19 at the time. Records revealed Sarah had been engaged to a prospector named William Hayes, with their wedding planned for the spring of 1899. But tragedy struck. Hayes perished in a deadly avalanche while crossing the Chilkoot Pass only 2 months before the ceremony. That same winter, Sarah herself succumbed to pneumonia. Unable to bear the grief, her parents abandoned Dia the following summer. The gown I had discovered was Sarah's wedding dress, never worn, sealed away in the armoire for more than a century. The more I learned, the stronger the disturbances became. I would find photographs scattered around the workshop in the morning. My equipment moved, and sometimes I heard faint, sorrowful sobs coming from near the dress. The final event came 3 weeks after I first brought it home. near midnight, while finishing paperwork for a prospective sale to a Seattle collector. I heard faint music drifting from the workshop, a tune like a music box or player piano. When I entered, I froze in disbelief. The wedding dress was suspended 3 feet in the air, swaying as though being worn by an invisible figure. And then she appeared fully before me, the young woman from the photographs, ethereal but unmistakable, clad in the gown, waltzing gracefully in rhythm with the distant melody. She turned toward me, her face a portrait of sadness. Her voice reached me like an echo from far away. I never got to wear it. I never got to dance at my wedding. I stood transfixed, unable to speak, as she continued her mournful waltz. After several minutes, she slowly faded from view. The music silenced, and the gown settled gently back onto the workbench. The next morning, shaken, I carefully packed the dress into its box and drove it back to Dia. I returned it to the same armoire, arranging it exactly as I had found it. As I left the ruined store, I swear I heard a woman's voice on the wind whispering, "Thank you." I never returned, and I never spoke of what happened until now. Some objects are not meant to be traded for profit. Some relics are bound to the places where their stories ended, guarding their secrets. The wedding dress still rests in Dia untouched, as perfect as the day it was sewn, and locals say that on certain quiet nights, when the wind carries just right, faint strains of waltz music drift through the ruins, as though someone is finally dancing the wedding that never came to be. My grandfather often told me stories from the old days of the Alaska Railroad, when it served as the lifeline connecting far-off towns to the wider world. He had worked as a conductor for 37 years, braving some of the harshest yet most breathtaking terrain imaginable. My name is Marcus Washington, and I am 24 years old. Unlike him, I never worked the rails for a living, but trains have been my passion since I was a boy. I collect old railroad artifacts, pore over maps of forgotten routes, and spend my weekends tracing abandoned lines across the state. That same passion is what carried me to McCarthy in October of 2023, a remote settlement that sits at the very end of one of Alaska's most isolated railroad spurs, the Copper River and Northwestern Railway laid down its tracks in the early 1910s to haul copper, or from the Cacat mines all the way to the shipping docks at Cordova. When the mines shut down in 1938, the railroad was abandoned, leaving behind nearly 200 miles of track, bridges, and tunnels that slowly began to vanish back into the wilderness. Most of the original line has long since been reclaimed by nature or dismantled for scrap. Yet in certain stretches near McCarthy, you can still find remnants of the engineering marvel that once carried millions of tons of ore across mountains that seemed impossible to conquer. I had been planning this particular trip for months, with the hope of photographing the remaining trestles and documenting what was left of the line before the oncoming Alaskan winter made such access impossible. I rolled into McCarthy on a gray Thursday afternoon. Having navigated the notorious McCarthy Road, which follows roughly the same route the railway once did, the 60-mile drive is a punishing gauntlet of potholes, washouts, and one-lane bridges that test both the driver's patience and the vehicle's endurance. McCarthy itself is home to perhaps 25 full-time residents, most of whom scrape by catering to the trickle of tourists who come through during the brief summer months. I had arranged to stay at a small bed and breakfast operated by an elderly woman named Rose Delano, whose family had been rooted in the area since the age of the railroad. Rose, in her 70s, had silver hair and the weathered hands of someone who had endured decades of Alaskan living. She seemed genuinely happy to host a guest with an interest in local rail history. Over dinner that first evening, she shared vivid recollections of the old days when the train rumbled in twice weekly, delivering supplies, mail, and weary travelers. My father worked for the line, she told me as we sipped coffee in her kitchen. He was a section foreman responsible for maintaining about 10 miles of track through some of the worst terrain imaginable. She explained that he often remarked how the railroad had been built more out of sheer determination than sound engineering logic. Rose cautioned me about venturing along the old line alone, especially in October when daylight was scarce and the weather unpredictable. Still, she understood the lure of railroad history and even loaned me an old trail map showing the remaining accessible sections. The next morning, I set off with my camera, hiking boots, and enough provisions for a full day's exploration. The stretch I intended to document lay about 3 miles from town, where the tracks had once spanned a deep gorge by means of a massive timber trestle. My research suggested portions of that bridge still survived, though the rails themselves had been stripped away long ago. The hike out carried me through thick forest and rugged ground, devoid of any signs of recent human presence. Yet here and there, the ghost of the old roadbed could be spotted, marked by grading and drainage ditches carved out by crews more than a century earlier. As I walked, I tried to picture what it must have been like for those early railroad men, carving a path through country that resisted every intrusion. I reached the gorge around midday and found the remnants of the trestle precisely where the map indicated. The sight was breathtaking even in its ruined state. The bridge had been constructed from enormous timbers, some nearly 3 feet thick, arranged in the intricate latticework that defined early 20th century railroad design. Roughly half the structure still stood, though it was clearly too unstable to cross. The missing portions lay in the gorge below, where splintered beams and rusted iron fittings were scattered across the rocks. I spent hours photographing the bridge from different perspectives, documenting the craftsmanship and engineering that would have been considered state-of-the-art in its day. The afternoon remained quiet, broken only by the wind sighing through the trees and the occasional caw of distant ravens. It was exactly the serene, isolated experience I had been seeking. As the sun lowered behind the western mountains, I began stowing my gear in preparation for the trek back. The October light faded fast, and I wanted to be safely off the trail before night closed in. That was when I heard it low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep within the forest. My first thought was that it must be a helicopter or small plane, but the cadence was wrong. It was mechanical, steady, like the labored chuffing of a steam locomotive straining against a heavy grade. I froze, listening harder. The sound grew louder, clearer, and with a jolt of fear, I realized it was emanating from the direction of the abandoned rail line, not just vaguely from that area, but directly from the tracks themselves, as though a train were on approach. I tried to reason it out, perhaps some kind of equipment being used for maintenance on the road, or maybe a hidden mining operation I hadn't known about. But as the noise swelled, other sounds layered beneath it, the rhythmic click of wheels on rail joints, the squeal of steel brakes, and, unmistakably, the shrill blast of a steam whistle echoing through the mountains. Every rational thought insisted this was impossible. No train had run this line since 1938. The rails were gone, the bridges rotting, and there was no conceivable explanation for locomotive traffic in this desolate place. And yet my ears told a different story. Gripping my camera, I positioned myself with a clear view of the bridge approach, convinced that whatever produced the sound would soon appear. The noises grew so distinct, I could pick out each element: the deep breathing exhaust of a steam engine, the rattle of cars in tow, and voices shouting what sounded like workmen's commands. That was when the headlight pierced the gloom. A single bright beam swept through the forest, aligned perfectly along the vanished track. Behind it emerged the dark bulk of a steam locomotive, its smokestack silhouetted against the twilight sky. Behind the engine trailed a long string of ore cars, each appearing loaded with copper from the Kennet mines. My hands shook violently as I raised the camera and began snapping shots, uncertain whether any would come out clear. Through the lens, I could see details that should have been lost to time the locomotive's narrow-gauge design, painted in the dark green livery of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. Figures moved inside the cab, men dressed in the heavy work clothes of early 20th century crews. The train thundered toward the shattered trestle at full speed, showing no sign of slowing. Panic welled up inside me. I wanted to cry out, to somehow warn them that the bridge was impassable, but no sound escaped my throat. I could only watch in mute terror as the locomotive reached the broken span. What followed defied every law of reality I knew. Instead of tumbling into the gorge, the train pressed forward into empty space, rolling across a 100-foot gap as if invisible rails still carried it. A full locomotive and its trailing cars moved weightless across thin air before vanishing into the dark timber beyond the gorge. The sounds of its passage slowly faded until only the natural hush of forest remained. I stood transfixed at the edge of the ruined bridge, staring after the impossible sight. Eventually, I turned to my camera, desperate for proof, but each photo I had taken showed only the silent forest and the shattered timbers of the trestle. No engine, no cars, nothing at all. The hike back to McCarthy was 3 miles of pure dread, every rustle of branches setting my nerves on edge. More than once, I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see the phantom headlight bearing down the trail. When at last I stumbled into Rose's bed and breakfast, I was shaking so badly I could hardly speak. Rose took one glance at me and put on a pot of strong coffee, seating me at her kitchen table as I stammered through my story. She listened quietly, nodding now and then, but never interrupting, her expression calm, almost knowing. When I finally fell silent, she gazed into her cup for a long while before looking up. "You aren't the first to see that train," she said softly. "My father saw it 3 times during his years on the section, always at dusk, always crossing that same trestle. He believed it was the spirits of the men who perished building the line, forever trying to finish their run to Cordova." She rose and opened an old wooden cabinet, pulling out a yellowed clipping from 1923. The headline read, "Train Derailment Claims 6 Lives Near McCarthy." The article recounted how a locomotive and 4 ore cars had plunged from the trestle during a winter storm, killing the crew. Their bodies, it said, were never recovered from the gorge below. "Every few years, someone claims to spot them," Rose went on. "It's always the same train, always rolling across the collapsed bridge, always bound for Cordova, with its load of copper or..." My father used to say those men would keep running that route until the bridge is restored and they're finally able to finish their journey. I left McCarthy the very next morning, cutting short what was supposed to be a week-long stay. I have never returned, and I have no intention of doing so. Yet sometimes, in the stillness of night, when the faint whistle of a modern freight train drifts on the wind, my mind goes back to those ghostly railroad workers, endlessly bound to their route through the wilds of Alaska. The photographs I snapped that day revealed nothing beyond the decaying skeleton of a trestle bridge in a remote canyon. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Somewhere among those woods near McCarthy, the final train still thunders on, its spectral crew and phantom cargo forever committed to a journey that will never find its end. As a substitute teacher, I've taken assignments in some of the most far-flung corners of Alaska, but nothing in my travels prepared me for what awaited in the abandoned schoolhouse at Katina. My name is Emma Thompson, and I am 26 years old. For the past 4 years, I've been moving from one isolated community to another, stepping in wherever certified teachers are in short supply. The work can be grueling, but it is deeply rewarding, especially when you witness children in these cut-off settlements receiving the education they deserve. Most towns I visit are still alive, with open schools and enthusiastic students. But now and then, I come across places where the schools have been deserted for decades, casualties of shrinking populations or economic collapse that emptied entire communities. Katina was one of these cases, once a bustling railroad hub with over 1,000 residents. Today it struggles to maintain a year-round population of fewer than 50, most of them retirees or folks relying on seasonal tourism during Alaska's brief summers. I arrived there in late September of 2023. Not for a teaching job, but to conduct research for a master's thesis I was writing on rural education in the state. The town's old schoolhouse, built in 1915, was said to be a prime surviving example of early frontier educational architecture. I had secured permission from the town council to study and photograph the building, with the agreement that I would share my findings with their historical society. Perched on a small hill with a view over the remnants of Katina's main street, the two-story wooden structure still stood tall. Its lofty windows were designed to capture as much sunlight as possible during the long Alaskan winters. From its opening in 1915 until 1987, the school had served generations of children before dwindling enrollment forced classes to be moved to Glenallen nearby. Since that closure, the building had been locked up and largely left to decay beneath the punishing weather. When I drove into town on a gray, rain-threatening afternoon along the 70-mile gravel road from the Richardson Highway, Katina felt half abandoned, with most of its structures weathered and poorly maintained. The few townsfolk I encountered were kind enough, though surprised that anyone would care about their old school. The man responsible for the building was Robert Steinberg, who had attended classes there in the 1960s and later served on the school board when it shut down. Now in his 70s, with thick silver hair and the calloused hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors, Robert was genuinely delighted to know the school's history was being recorded. He spoke for nearly an hour, recalling names of teachers, stories of students, and the struggles of winters that pressed harshly on everyone, especially children who trudged miles in the snow to attend. "That place holds a lot of memories," he told me as he pressed the heavy keys into my hand. "Some happy, some not so happy. We lost kids along the way, accidents, sickness. But the school kept on until there weren't enough left to fill the desks." He cautioned me that the wiring had long been disconnected, so I'd need my own lighting, and he warned that some boards upstairs had weakened with age, suggesting I stay mainly on the first floor. Thanking him, I climbed the hill, ready to begin. The door creaked open with a drawn-out groan that reverberated through the empty interior. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the pungent scent of aged wood and paper, undisturbed for decades. The ground floor held two spacious classrooms, a small office, once used by the principal, and a slim hallway leading to a staircase that rose to the second level. Much of the old equipment remained where it had last been used. Wooden desks lined up neatly, blackboards still mounted at the front, and faded teaching charts clinging to the walls, their words barely legible. In one room stood a globe from the 1950s, marked with nations and borders that history had long since erased. In the other, a piano sat silent in the corner, its yellowed keys and broken strings a testament to neglect. I spent hours carefully photographing and jotting down notes, marveling at how well the building preserved the essence of a frontier classroom, where children once wrestled with the fundamentals of learning in one of America's harshest landscapes. As daylight waned, I made the choice to climb the stairs and inspect the second floor, moving cautiously as I remembered Robert's warning. Testing each step, I found most of the structure still held strong despite its age. The upper level had been constructed as an auditorium and gathering space, complete with a modest stage and rows of benches facing forward. It was while I stood photographing the stage that I first heard it, the unmistakable toll of a school bell. The deep, resonant tone of bronze, ringing in the steady rhythm once used to summon children to class or release them for recess. Yet Robert had told me the bell was taken down years ago and relocated to a museum in Anchorage. Looking around, I saw the tower from the window, but it was clearly empty. I told myself it must be an odd quirk of acoustics, perhaps the wind playing tricks through the empty structure. But then it rang again, a new sequence, 3 short peals, followed by 2 long ones. I froze, recognizing it as the very pattern once used to end the school day. repeated countless times over the building's 72 years of service. The third time the sound came, it was not alone. Other noises accompanied it. The scraping of chairs across wooden planks, the shuffle of papers being gathered, and the distinct sound of children's voices bubbling with excitement as though the end of the school day had arrived echoed faintly through the old building. The noise drifted upward from the main floor classrooms directly beneath me. Moving slowly, I retraced my steps down the stairway, careful not to interrupt whatever uncanny activity was taking place below. As I stepped into the lower hallway, the sounds sharpened, unmistakable now. High-pitched voices filled the air, animated, cheerful. The very tones children use when something has stirred their enthusiasm. Every now and then, a word or phrase slipped through, clearly. Homework, recess, Miss Anderson. I edged toward the nearest classroom, peering around the doorway. What I saw waiting beyond the frame defied logic, but my eyes refused to let me deny it. The room brimmed with children, perhaps 20, maybe 25 of them, ranging in ages from around 6 years old up to early teenagers. They were dressed in clothing from another era, styles belonging to the 1940s or 1950s. Plain cotton dresses on the girls, knickerbockers and suspenders on the boys, sturdy shoes meant for walking long distances. At the head of the class stood a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair neatly pinned back. She wore a long skirt and crisp white blouse, the fashion of mid-20th century school teachers. She faced the blackboard, writing in the precise, elegant cursive that instructors of that time drilled endlessly into their pupils. The children, solid and busy, hardly looked ghost-like at all. They busied themselves, collecting books, shoving papers into satchels, pulling on coats and caps, and chatting about the everyday concerns of school children. Yet something felt profoundly out of place, though I couldn't immediately pinpoint what it was. Only after watching for several minutes did I recognize the source of unease. None of them, not the children, not the teacher, cast any shadows, though sunlight streamed through the tall windows. They were there, yet not entirely there, existing half in reality, half in memory. Then the teacher lifted her head, meeting my eyes directly. Her face bore a kind expression, her smile carrying genuine affection for her pupils. When she spoke, her voice had the confident clarity of an experienced educator. "Class is dismissed for today," she said, but her gaze lingered on me, not her students. "Don't forget to complete your arithmetic for tomorrow, and dress warmly for the walk home. Winter is coming early." The children filed out in neat rows, passing only inches from where I stood in the hallway. As each one went by, a faint chill brushed against me, like a pocket of cold air wrapped around their forms. Some of the younger children tilted their heads to glance curiously at me, but none showed alarm. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, her blonde hair braided, clad in a red wool coat, paused directly before me. She tugged softly at my sleeve, her voice carrying an eerie, faraway echo. "Are you our new teacher?" she asked sweetly. "Miss Anderson has been waiting for someone to help with the older grades. There are so many of us now, and we all want to learn." Before I could answer, she smiled and moved on, joining the others as they streamed toward the school's front doors. I followed them outside, watching as they spread out down the hillside into what had once been the residential heart of Chatina. Some children walked alone, others clustered in pairs or groups, all heading homeward with the casual stride of kids finishing a school day. The teacher, Miss Anderson, emerged last. She paused beside me on the steps, surveying the empty settlement below. Her voice softened. "We have been waiting such a long time for the school to reopen. The children long for their lessons. They return here again and again, hoping there will be teachers, books, proper classrooms." She turned her eyes toward mine, and within them I saw hope and sorrow twined together. "Will you stay and teach them?" she asked earnestly. "They have been without guidance for so many years. They deserve to finish what they started." To learn all they were meant to know before. She hesitated, her expression darkening. Before the accident, I wanted to ask what she meant. What calamity had taken her and her students, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, she gave me one last, gentle smile and walked down the hill after her pupils, disappearing into the ghostly settlement. Alone now on the school steps, I felt the silence press in around me. That evening, when I returned the keys to Robert Steinberg, I asked him plainly if he remembered Miss Anderson and whether anything tragic had happened at the school. His face fell, and he motioned me inside for coffee. Settling into an old recliner beside his wood stove, he began, his voice heavy with memory. Margaret Anderson taught here between 1952 and 1967, he said quietly. She was the finest teacher we ever had. Loved those children, gave her whole life to them. She never married, said the students were her family. He paused, staring into the steam rising from his cup. The accident happened in February of '67. The worst blizzard we ever saw, struck without warning. Forecasts said nothing of it. She kept all the children inside to keep them safe, but the heating system failed during the night. His voice faltered. When rescuers arrived the next morning, they found them in the main classroom. Miss Anderson had gathered the children around the piano, trying to keep their spirits up, but a faulty chimney filled the room with carbon monoxide. 23 children and their teacher, all gone. Silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the stove. I spent one final night in Chatina, but I never again set foot inside that schoolhouse. The next morning, as I loaded my car for the drive back to Anchorage, the sound of the school bell suddenly rang across the desolate town, 3 short chimes followed by 2 long ones. The familiar call to gather for lessons that would never again be taught.